afternoon. Thanks very much for giving your time today for a couple of hours. I hope that you find it rewarding and that you feel rewarded at the end. This is an embryonic idea, the Big Society and the Big Society Network, so it's here to be shaped by you. We've got a very, very diverse group, which is fantastic. Harvard Business School did a study on how brainstorming works and discovered that the more diverse a group is, the more original and distinctive your ideas are, but the less they tend to get implemented afterwards. So there's a challenge to you. We have to stick together through this. It's not just this afternoon. We have to see this through together. And that's not just this room, it's all 61.6 million of us, which is a frightening thought. So, Big Society. It's controversial, it's raw, it's tribal, it's just come out of an election period. And yet we can fool ourselves because the public aren't quite as engaged in ideologies as we might like to think. They're more depressed about tennis and football than that. And Ipsos Mori, who did some research without us asking, discovered that 14%, 1/4, that's 1 in 7 people, thinks that they know something or a lot about the Big Society. And most of those are probably civil servants. So we can kid ourselves. So 6 out of 7 people don't really have a strong, informed opinion, but they do have a knee-jerk reaction to that. And I think it would be fair to say that it is better to assume, at the very least, scepticism, and in many cases hostility, because the Big Society, whilst it speaks to us quite powerfully as a piece of language, it feels like something we should desire and should be on the side of. For some people it's just potentially a fig leaf for the shrinking state, and I think it's suddenly going to be withdrawn. It's asking me as a citizen to do more when I don't have the time, the skill, the inclination to do it. It's all of those things. So on everything that I've worked on in terms of mass engagement, things like comic relief, change the world for a fiver, I've tried to assume a start point that is positive scepticism, if I can put it that way, if there is such a thing, and I think we need to have that. So Big Society as a term is still very raw and not really that well understood, but I think everybody believes it's a potentially powerful idea, and that's why people like David Miliband are falling over themselves to say this only really belongs to our party, and somebody else then snatches it away and says no, it's ours. It is an apolitical idea, and particularly our part of it, as I'll come on to. So there's the ideology. There's also a set of policies, now endorsed by the coalition, which is things like setting up your own schools, an army of 5,000 expert volunteers who are, if you like, social enterprise ambassadors, but they're in a very practical form, people in the public sector being able to set up their own cooperatives, local citizens claiming unused public assets, buildings, etc., and turning them to their use. All of these things, which are, in many cases, I think, again, extremely positive, sensible, practical when they're looked at properly, but they are still quite remote from most people in terms of a simple, everyday action that they might take. So setting up your own school may be fantastic, but actually for many people they don't believe they have the skill set or necessarily the need. And volunteering is fine, except that 74% of the country don't do it on a monthly basis, and the amount that do is declining, so there's something wrong there. So 5,000 people among 61.6 million, how much of an effect can that make? As it turns out, I think a hell of a lot, but you can see the line of thinking people might take. So the third element, beyond ideology and policies, is the Big Society Network. And the Big Society Network, which is formative, has kept a relatively low profile, although even on that basis we're getting about 300 emails a day each, is something that is different. It's an independent, challenging partner to government. We are hooked in, we're privileged enough to be hooked in at the highest level of government, to be dealing with something which they consider to be their most important legacy, alongside dealing with the economic crisis. But we are an apolitical, cross-party, practical organisation, nascent, small, just got our bank account to give you some idea of how nascent and small it is, and a small nucleus of people who need a large nucleus of talent such as yourselves to actually make it work. So what is our mission? Our mission is to encourage and enable practical local action by citizens. To encourage and enable practical local action by citizens. And I've deliberately not used the term, I wouldn't even necessarily use the term citizen to citizens, I have to say, but I certainly wouldn't use the term community or active citizenship or anything that smacks of social engineering, because my personal experience is that as soon as you do that, you switch people off in droves. We really are talking about things that are very, very simple, local, practical actions. Why? There is a paradox in this country. On the one hand, we can talk about the unengaged. What do we mean by the unengaged? Only 3% of us go to public meetings. And that's because many of them are miserable or badly run or not particularly interesting, or we think we can't affect it, or we don't have time. But 97% of us are unengaged on that basis. 61% of people feel they can't affect local issues. So again, that's a majority. 74%, as I alluded to, don't volunteer. So we're living in a society where a lot of us feel disempowered and disengaged. We're also living in a society, which is something that I feel passionate about, where there is more isolation than ever before. Now, privacy we all need and is nurturing, but isolation we don't need and is strangling us. And we have more isolated, lonely people within our communities than ever before. So we are trying to find ways in which we can tackle these big issues. And on the one hand, that paints a bleak, or at least difficult and challenging picture. On the other hand, I've had 45, 50 meetings in the last 6 weeks alone with absolutely inspirational people and groups, some of whom are in the room today. There are 900,000, estimated to be 900,000 community groups in this country, or possibly close to 1 million. There are 238,000 social entrepreneurs, estimated according to the only survey that's trying to do it. And only 1% of those social entrepreneurs get formal funding. I owe that statistic to Cliff Pryor, so I'll acknowledge it now. Now, if you can imagine what could happen to this country, what could happen to the problems of disempowerment, disengagement, loneliness, isolation, all kinds of poverty, not just literal poverty, if we were to encourage more people to join groups, strengthen existing groups and show them how they can act, even if they started to do bowling or jazz or football or whatever it may happen to be, that actually the power within that group lies to do other things as well. Imagine if we could take 1% of social entrepreneurs and took it to 3 or even 5% of social entrepreneurs being backed.